The Paradox by Joanna.C. Prologue. The Last Pilgrim. Rain had forgotten how to fall. It hung above a city in long silver threads, suspended between heaven and earth as though the sky itself rose. The streets below were empty, not really abandoned, but waiting. The old church stood where the city no longer remembered it existed. Some doors are not made of wood, they are a memory. The old church had stood on the edge of the moor for longer than maps admitted. Once, kings had knelt beneath its valued ceiling. Once, bells had rung across the valley, and once, prayers had filled its stones, until the walls themselves seemed capable of answering. Now, only silence remained. An old woman climbed the worn steps. Age might have bent her shoulders, but not her resolve. She had no umbrella. The rain drifted around her despite that, without ever touching her skin. People said the rain never fell upon pilgrims who came seeking the third way. Whether that was a miracle or courtesy, no one knew. Her boots scraped softly against the ancient stone. Each step cost her something. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from years, the kind that leave their mark upon the bone. She reached the great oak doors. Before she had a chance to touch them, they opened on their own, as if though the church had recognized the weight she carried. Dust floated through pale shafts of forgotten light, just simply existing. Remains of broken pews leaned together like exhausted pilgrims who had finally abandoned hope for answers. Roots split the flagstones. Moss and ivy climbed the cracked pillars, but the altar remained untouched by time. No birds nested here, no spider spun its web. Even decayed seemed unwilling to disturb the silence. The old woman crossed herself out of habit. She stopped and smiled sadly. I don't suppose that matters here. Her voice disappeared into the sanctuary, or perhaps the sanctuary simply kept it. She walked toward the altar. Each footstep echoed longer than it should have, as though someone stood beside her, someone whose footstep had become too old for ears to hear. She reached inside the pocket of her worn coat. For several long moments, she did not remove what rested there. Instead, she closed her eyes, remembering. Then she opened her hand. A silver Mobius ring rested upon her palm, simple, unadorned, without end and without beginning. One endless surface, one impossible path. Running through its center like scar left upon reality, a single hairline crack. Impossible, beautiful. The old woman smiled through weary eyes. My grandmother carried this. My mother carried it after her. Other people did. She took another breath. I have carried it for 53 years. Her fingers gently traced the impossible fracture. They always said, she laughed softly, that when life offers you only two roads, her voice faltered, this belongs to her. She climbed the final 3 small steps. The altar was cold, older than a church, older than a city, older, perhaps, than prayer itself. Carefully, with both hands, she laid the ring upon a stone. Metal touched the ancient rock. The sound was impossibly quiet, yet an echo hummed through the sanctuary like a single ring of a bell, somewhere far, beyond stars, beyond any hell, deeper than dreams. Something listened. Silence answered first. The woman bowed her head. I have come to return what was never mine. Nothing answered. Wind sighed through the broken stained glass windows, and she remained kneeling. I have walked every path that was placed before me. I chose duty. A pause. I buried my husband. I buried my son. They told me there were only two futures. One hand tightened against the altar. If I saved one child, her voice broke, the other would die. A tear struck the stone. If I saved neither, thousands would. She laughed once, a tired sound. They called it destiny, justice, a necessity. She lowered her head, whispering, I called it cruelty. A candle burst into blue flame. The old woman raised her gaze. She did not flinch. Then another, until all forgotten candles throughout the ruined sanctuary bathed with quiet blue hue. No match, no spark, only flame remembering itself. The shadows retreated and then stopped. Slowly they flowed toward the altar. Every shadow, every corner of darkness gathered around the silver ring. The old woman closed her eyes. So, she whispered, the stories were true. The shadows climbed the altar, pulling around the ring, around her hands. They carried no icy cold, no malice, only stillness. A stillness so complete that even grief seemed to be afraid to breathe. The church changed, not in stone, but in meaning. Distances unfolded. The ceiling climbed beyond sight. The broken walls dissolved into endless horizon of darkness, filled with stars that had never belonged to any sky. The candles burned like distant constellations, and the ring began to turn, not rolling, not sliding, but turning as though reality itself had become its axis. The hairline clack rolled, softly gray, glowing the color of dawn before morning remembered its own name. Then a whisper, not from above or below, but everywhere. A voice without age and without form, without beginning. Why have you come? The old woman lowered her head more, not in worship, but rather in honesty. I have come to ask whether there was ever another. The ring continued turning and the crack shined brighter. The voice spoke again. There is always another road. The old woman closed her eyes. They said choice is an illusion. Sometimes. They said fate cannot be escaped. Sometimes. They said sacrifice is inevitable. Silence lingered long enough for hope to become painful. Sometimes. I do not ask you to save anyone. The shadows gathered more closely. I do not ask you to undo what has been done. The candles flickered. I ask only. Her voice became almost too quiet to hear as she raised her gaze in surrender. Show me the third way. The very moment the old woman's words left her lips, everything stopped. The rain, the candles, the wind, even time itself. The ring lifted from the altar, floating before the old woman, turning axis of reality and possibility into itself endlessly as the old woman gazed on it, with her lips slightly parted. The crack widened, the silver within shone brighter. Within, she saw something, something enough to steal the breath from her lungs. She began to weep, not from sorrow, but recognition. The voice came ancient and gentle, as inevitable as dreams. The third way is never found. The ring drifted back toward the altar, and when it touched the stone, the candles began to slowly extinguish themselves. Same way, the endless sky began to fold back into the broken timber. Through me, it is made, the timeless voice declared. She felt it as she looked down on her empty hands, and they didn't feel empty for the first time in half of her life lived through. A possibility, a new doorway made, opened. Outside, the rain began to remember how to fall. Keep it, may it serve you as a reminder a little more. Old woman lowered her eyes to the silver ring. The stars above vanished, fading slowly at first, then gaining speed. In a hurry she stood up and asked her last question she still could. When is my path finished? Rain started to make its presence known, whispering softly against the old roof and what remained of the stained glass windows. Then the voice answered as if from further away. When it chooses to leave. Woman's hands closed gently around the ring. How will I know? There was only stillness for a while. You won't until you do. With final words, like a last echo of a forgotten dream, the church became only ruined church once more. Darkness returned, closing over the sanctuary. The candles dimmed their flame in surrender, extinguishing fully. The only sign that they were truly lit was the faint smoke that curled upwards, swirling peacefully. The moment of silence was interrupted suddenly with a heavy rainfall, and somewhere, more than a century earlier, a little girl woke screaming from a nightmare no child should have ever been able to remember.